narrative. Go ahead, you're the historian. I'm listening and I'm learning.
Okay. The city of Carthage, it began life as a city-state, and the dates that people normally give for its founding is 814 BC. On a modern map, it's on the coast of what is today Tunisia, and it began life as a city-state before expanding to control a large part of North Africa and control a whole bunch of islands in the Mediterranean. So it became a major world power. And why Carthage is important is not only is it an African city, but some people say it was the richest city of antiquity, because the trade networks that fed Carthage from networks coming in from all over the world. And that meant that every product, be it animal, be it mineral, if it was available, the Carthaginians would have access to it, and they were able to build massive wealth in this, on a modern map, Tunisian city-state. So that's where it is, and that's why it's important for us to talk about it, because also a lot of modern politics, how politics goes down today, a lot of that was echoed in what happened when the Romans conquered Carthage. The way that they exploited Carthage, controlled its foreign policy, turned it into a client state, is the same way that Western governments turn African and the global South's governments into client states. So there's lots that we can learn from Carthage.
Well, maybe you need to back up a little bit for me anyway to sort of fill me in, because you sort of the way I view history, and maybe many people watching, listening, or what have you, you kind of go from Nile Valley civilization, Kemet, and the invasions by the Assyrians, and then by the Greeks in about 350 BC, something like that, and then so that then the Greeks took over, and all of history so-called started with the Greeks, and then coming down to 35 BC or something, and then the Romans took over. And you don't know much about Carthage, and from my perspective, and I kind of wonder how Carthage relates to Egypt, because Egypt is, in a sense, Northeast Africa, and you're telling me that Carthage is Northern Africa, where Tunisia is, and I imagine that Libya is next to it, etc., etc. Give me an idea of the relationship then between Carthage and Egypt in any sort of antiquity or any sort of continuity in terms of trade. For example, who are the Phoenicians? How did the Phoenicians fit into that? Are they part of Carthage?
Okay, let me explain. The Phoenicians were the ancient people of what we would today call Palestine, what we would today call Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Herodotus visited the Phoenicians and asked them, where do you people come from? And they said, we came from the Eritrean Sea. And so many people interpret that as somewhere in East Africa, perhaps the Horn of Africa, or even perhaps where Eritrea is today. So these people originated in East Africa, moved north, and became the people of Phoenicia, where they set up a whole series of city-states. They never created a country, they created city-states, highly civilized city-states. And from where they were on the coast of Palestine, the coast of Lebanon, that coast is the Mediterranean. And so they established Mediterranean colonies. And what they would do would be sail along the North African coast, sail along southern Europe, their coast, and they would establish colonies. And they would get some of their people to get off the boat, talk to the local people, establish a colony with the local people. And so you've now got people speaking Phoenician, all networked with each other, picking up trade goods from here, there, and everywhere. And in North Africa, some people say 1101 AD, they set up a city that they called their old town, Utica. And by the time we get to 814, they set up their new town, Carthage. So Carthage, Carthaginian, means their new town.
Mm.
Now that's the Phoenicians. Now the Phoenicians then were largely black people, but not completely, because of course, being in Palestine, they're going to be mixing with other groups of people. When they got to North Africa, the indigenous people of North Africa were the Libyans. And the Libyans in those days were black. I know that some black scholars like Chancellor Williams and Sheikh Anta Diop say they were white. False. They were black.
Mm.
All right. And then another group of people moved in, and those were Africans from the Nile Valley. We know Africans from the Nile Valley were there because their amulets have been dug up in Carthage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Moreover, a lot of Carthaginian art looks very Nile Valley-ish. The same dress code, the same hair, the same body proportions. If I was to show you some Phoenician art, a lot of it you would think, no, that's not Phoenician, that's Egyptian or that's Sudanese. They look that similar. The styles are pretty much identical. The art that I'm talking about, there's a bunch of furniture decoration called the Nimrud ivories. And these ivories were made somewhere around 9th century BC, 8th century BC. They're furniture decorations made of ivory. And if I showed you those decorations, you would say, that's not Phoenician, that's Egyptian. That's not Phoenician, that's Sudanese. They really do look the same because of the style. A Nile Valley style influenced what the Phoenicians were doing. But in terms of specifically Egyptian and specifically Sudanese amulets, those have definitely been found in Carthage and shows that there were Nile Valley Africans also in Carthage. Now, by the time the Greeks visit, they tell us that the greatest temple in Carthage is the temple of Imhotep.
Is this Herodotus saying this?
Yeah, so now they don't use the term Imhotep, they use the term Aesculapius.
Oh, yes.
Yeah? And we can infer that's the temple of Imhotep, and that was the grandest of the temples in Carthage. But this is, as I said, coming from the Greek sources. So essentially, 4 ethnicities came together to make Carthage. The Libyans, who are the indigenes, the Phoenicians, who are the people that set up the colony 814 BC, the Sudanese, and the Egyptians. These 4 people, but obviously numerical dominance is the Libyans. So we could call this a Libyan civilization if we wanted to.
And when you say Sudanese, these are the Nubians.
Yeah, Kushites.
Yeah.
Now, let me explain how we know the Kushites were there, because this blows people's minds. I hope you're sitting down, because I'm about to drop some heavy science.
Good. I love that.
Okay. The legendary Ivan van Sertima made the point that there was a medieval book by a scholar called Florian de Acampo. And in this medieval book, it talked about how Pharaoh Taharqa of Kush conquered Spain. Right? Now, that's not... That's what Professor Van
First
Sertima
time-
found.
That's the first time I'm hearing of that one. I mean, that's a
Yeah,
heavy right
yeah,
there.
yeah.
The Harka. No,
Tahaka.
that's 25th dynasty Egypt.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. And he had and he was Kushite.
That's right. That's right.
And he drove out the Assyrians from Egypt.
Or attempted to, or attempted to.
Okay, didn't complete the drive that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, now what Professor Van Sertima found, he hadn't found the book Florian de Ocampo.
Mhm.
What he found was a reference to the book. And he put that content in his book, Golden Age of the Moor. So in the introduction written by him, he has this information. Okay, that's where the evidence was at. Now, what happened is I found a way that I could search for a reprint of that book, Florian de Ocampo. The book is called Chronica General. And I was able to find the PDF where somebody reprinted it and turned it into actually typed text. And I found out that the information about Taharko conquering Spain is the subject of chapter 13 of this book. And one of my colleagues, his wife is a Spanish medieval expert. And between them, they translated the chapter and sent the chapter to me. And it's a very detailed account. And it's definitely Taharka because the account says, and his enemy was Sennacherib. You all know Sennacherib, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It talks about him being from the land of the Ethiopians and ruler of Egypt. So we can work it out from the land of Kush and ruler of Kemet. Him battling Sennacherib, that's in there. And Florian de Ocampo, the Spanish medieval chronicler, is putting together what he knows from a Spanish perspective of how Pharaoh Taharko of Kush used to rule his country. And so Taharko is one of the great rulers of African history that nobody bigs him up enough. Because people should be getting Florian de Ocampo. I shouldn't be the only person with an English language translation of chapter 13 of that book. Now, here's the point. If Taharko had conquered Spain, he would have to have seized control of Carthage. Yeah? And so that would explain why not only are there Egyptian amulets in the country, Sudanese amulets. So you know the deity Khnum is specifically Sudanese. It's not an Egyptian deity.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it's not Egyptian, it's Sudanese.
But, well, he's a creator deity. He creates mankind, like the potter on the wheel and blows the breath of God into the human being. So that's original, meaning that's a creation of mankind.
Yeah. But what happened is
goes back to Nubia, not primarily to Kemet.
That's right. So we know that Khnum is considered more Nubian because there's a story that the late Egyptians tell about Pharaoh Zoser and Pharaoh Zoser having to consult the Nubian priests of Khnum. There was a famine or something, and it specifically says this. So, yeah, so if you're seeing Khnum in Carthage,
because again, that's like news to me because Zoser is the beginning of the nation state of Kemet, supposedly.
Yeah, and
And
also
you're
the first
telling
one
me
to build
that
pyramids.
he's consulting the Nubians
Yeah,
about whatever.
yeah, it was something to do with the famine. It was something to do with the famine.
Well,
Um,
again, that's evidence that the civilization came down the Nile and not
it-
came from somewhere else, uh, whatever. What's the name of the place that they always talk about?
oh, Sumer.
Yes, from Sumer or some other place, Atlantis or
Yeah, yeah,
something.
yeah, that's right, that's right, that's right. Yeah, so basically, that's how why we know that there was a Sudanese presence, not just an Egyptian one.
Mm.
Now, obviously, the Sudanese and Egyptian civilization is almost the same. They shared the same rulers, they worshiped the same deities, and so on. But I'm just shouting out the Sudanese because they don't get shouted out enough. And as I said, I believe that Pharaoh Taharqa should go down in history as one of the greatest Africans ever.
Well, I think one of the big things that I like about him, or as far as we know about him, whether
Yeah,
you call it Arco or whatever it's called, was when he invaded Kemet, so to speak, to drive out the Assyrians. He reestablished the Egyptian religion, if you will, and that was the basis of the Shabaka stone, which
hmm,
tells you so much about Egyptian religion, because what was on the Shabaka stone was actually a replication of original information going way back to the founding of Kemet itself. Though the Shabaka stone has been used as some kind of millstone and parts of it have been eroded, but
yeah,
he established a religion which was of extreme importance.
you're right. Let me read to you a bit of the translation, and it says, chapter 13, of the havoc that an Egyptian king called Taharqa, a native of the Ethiopian lands, wrought on the Spanish navies after this, and how those from Cadiz sent their messengers to him, which was a great cause for Taharqa from the Strait of Gibraltar not to pass further. Go ahead and go to other provinces in Spain, causing great destruction. That's how Florian de Ocampo begins his chapter 13, and it makes it quite clear that this Taharqa is mentioned in the sacred scriptures. So it's the same Tiharka in the Bible. They make that quite clear. And they make it quite clear that they brought their great armies of valiant and warlike black men, and he himself naturally was black, born in the land called Ethiopia, which has always been a very great region surrounded by the African provinces. And so by Ethiopia, we can infer he means Kush. And then goes on to describe it in the greatest of detail. And so what that means then is we have evidence in a medieval source talking about the conquest of Spain. And if you're going to conquer Spain, you're going to have to move through Carthage.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. And you're going to have to tie that up now with Hannibal and his elephants going
Oh,
over it.
that's later. We coming to that. We
I
come.
know.
Okay, now here's the thing. Let me read to you what two French scholars said about the resulting mix of populations. There's a scholar called Gilbert Charles Picard. There's his wife, Colette Charles Picard. And they did a book on Carthage called Daily Life in the Kingdom of Carthage. And this is what they said. The anthropological examination of skeletons found in tombs proves that there was no racial unity. The so-called Semitic type, characterized by the long, perfectly oval face, the thin aquiline nose, and the lengthened cranium enlarged over the nape of the neck, has not been found in Carthage.
Hmm.
Hear that? Let me say that again, has not been found in Carthage, nor for that matter in Sidon. On the other hand, another cranial form with a fairly short face, prominent parietal bumps, farther forward and lower down than usual, is common in Lebanese burial grounds and in those of the New Tyre. Perhaps it belonged to the real Phoenicians, but most of the Punic population seem to have had African and even Negro ancestors.
What are they calling Punic?
Punic, the language of the Phoenicians.
It was Punic, okay.
Yeah. So if they say Punic population, they mean Phoenician population.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There it is, had African and even Negro ancestors.
Now, where does that language fit into the so-called Afro-Asiatic or,
It's
Semitic?
Semitic. It's
Or what?
Semitic. Yeah. Oh, it's Semitic.
It's Semitic.
Yeah. So basically, the language of the Phoenicians overlaps with, languages like Hebrew and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that far.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that far. So it's part of Semitic. So in other words, it's part of Afro-Asiatic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the idea that the Phoenicians came from Eritrea, one of the reasons that the scholars believe that Afro-Asiatic started in Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it would be related to Geese?
Absolutely, yeah. And it would be related to Arabic. And so all the languages of Afro-Asiatic. So Afro-Asiatic is ancient Egyptian, Cushitic, Berber. Berber is the language of the desert Africans, such as the Tuaregs. And Hausa, the language of the northern Nigerians. All of those are related to Afro-Asiatic. For those scholars who believe in Afro-Asiatic, there are some scholars that doubt its existence, but for those who believe in it, those are those languages.
What does Obenga think? Because he's a linguist and we've done a lot of work on that.
He doesn't believe it.
Okay.
But let me give you another opinion, which again might blow your mind. There is a very famous Egyptologist in England, Professor Stephen Quirk. Professor Quirk is mainstream, but he is open to listening to Black people. He did a lecture at the British Museum where he explained that quite possibly, if you want to sound out ancient Egyptian words, the languages that you should use to sound it out would be run it against Hausa and then run it against Somali. So that's where he's going with it.
So what was Carthage like at its height in terms of a civilization, shall we say, or a nation state, really? Yeah.
It wasn't a nation state, it was an empire. So it was multi-ethnic. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Because the Phoenicians had all these colonies, when Phoenicia died in 573 BC, Carthage inherited its colonies. So the Carthaginians had access to Ibiza, Malta, Minorca, Majorca, Sardinia, parts of Spain, all of these places they controlled. Yeah. And because they controlled all of these places, they were controlling gold, cloth, wax, honey. They were slave trading, iron, mules, fruit, dates. They were controlling all of these products. And because they were controlling
Mediterranean trade, basically.
They were Mediterranean trade. Yeah. And it was only when the Greeks and Romans became a power in Europe that the Greeks and Romans could dispute what the Carthaginians had on lockdown. Do you see?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then in order to defend this, the Carthaginians, just like the Phoenicians, were serious about shipping.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
the best ships with, rows of, what they call them, kind of rowing, but you got rows of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. These ships were called triremes. The Carthaginians were about that.
Mhm.
So some of the best ships. Now, what did the city look like? At the height of the city of Carthage, it had a population of 700,000 people. According to the Greek and Roman accounts, there was a 23-mile circuit of walls going all the way around the city. And inside those walls were imposing temples, a fortress, many magnificent buildings. In one part of the city, there were 3 streets with rows of houses 6 stories high,
Wow.
right? There was a circular dock for the triremes. You had, uh, what else did you have? Amphitheaters,
Mhm.
temples, libraries, public restaurants, baths. Let me read a quote. There's a scholar called R. Bosworth Smith, and he wrote a book on Carthage in the 19th century. And he said, Carthage was beyond doubt the richest city of antiquity. Her
Mhm.
ships were to be found on all known seas, and there was probably no important product, animal, vegetable, or mineral of the ancient world which did not find a way into her harbors and pass through the hands of her citizens.
Mhm.
When the archaeologists dug up what was there, they found houses with washing and shower rooms, water cistern pipes, wastewater drains, and floors made of mosaic tiles.
Mhm. This is amazing, and I mean, to my mind, Carthage doesn't appear as a dot in history in
Mhm.
terms of my knowledge, and I think I'm reasonably well educated or knowledgeable, but you don't stop to think about Carthage. I mean, like I said, you know a little bit about Hannibal and
Mhm.
that's about it, and you know that it was the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. But you don't know its intrinsic worth and value in a full historical sense as an African nation or empire, as you call it. Because with that degree of shipping and trading and so on, they must have gone out into the Atlantic as well, I would imagine. And they would have probably had maps of different parts of Africa and Europe, maybe even going up to Britain and all this sort of thing. Where
Can
did
I,
these
can I jump in there, sir?
come from? Do you know? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I jump in there, sir? Um, there are two accounts of major Carthaginian shipping. We don't know when they happened, but they happened at some point in the 6th century BC, which is 500 and something, or the 5th century BC, 400 and something. And one of those accounts, I'm gonna tell you what happened.
Mhm.
Hanno commanded 60 ships along the north and west coast of Africa. The large number of people were transported to establish new colonies. Hanno sailed around the west coast of Africa, past the Senegal River, noting that it had crocodiles and hippopotami. And these Carthaginian sailing, Herodotus reports on it, and Herodotus said he didn't believe it.
Mhm.
Why he said he didn't believe it is because the account says, but the sun rose in a different part of the sky. Does that make sense? And Herodotus thought that that proves that the person that told him that story is lying. What he
Mhm.
didn't know is that if you circumnavigated Africa, you would get that. Do you see? So Herodotus, believing that the story is fake, the detail that he put in proves the story is actually true.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing, amazing, amazing. I mean, it just shows our history so altered, extensively.
That's right. That's right. Let
The
me
right out of history,
okay. Let me give you a for instance. You've come across Professor J.C. de Graaf Johnson's African Glory. Yeah. Professor de Graaf Johnson was quite possibly the first Black scholar to reproduce what the archaeologists believe Carthage looked like at its height. But that only exists in the first edition of de Graaf Johnson's book. So, when it was reissued by Black Classic Press, they took all the photographs out. The image that de Graaf Johnson reproduced, it was done by an archaeologist called Monsieur Paul Auclair. It's amazing. You can see the multi-story buildings. You can see the circular harbor. And if you were to show the image that John Coleman de Graaf Johnson reproduces to anybody and ask them, where's that? They would have said that's the city of Rome. That's the level of grandeur that was there.
You talk about the walled city and so on and so forth, and I'm sure the Romans destroyed that, very similar to the walled city in Benin, which from what I've been told, it had more mileage than the Great Wall of China.
Fact.
When you know about it or have seen it or anything, that was destroyed by the British. Amazing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, how Carthage ended up being destroyed was when the Romans, no, forget Romans, when the Greeks became a power, the Greeks becoming a powerful thing. You see, the Carthaginians used to have this idea that the Mediterranean belongs to them. And if foreign shipping turned up, they were very, very harsh. If a foreign ship turned up, they would ram and sink that ship on the grounds that you have no permission to be in Carthaginian waters. That's how the Carthaginians used to deal with it. So when the Greeks came along and became a powerful people in the 5th century BC, there were a whole series of battles between them and the Carthaginians. Now, Carthage didn't lose any territory, and a lot of the battles were over who was going to control Sicily. That's what the battles were over. And in 383 BC, the Greeks and the Carthaginians agreed a peace treaty. And then that peace treaty meant that from here on in, there are no more battles between the Carthaginians and the Greeks. However, when the Romans became a powerful people in the 3rd century BC, they were also going to dispute who is going to control the Mediterranean with Carthage. And the result of that now were 3 Punic Wars. Punic, again, it's the name of the Phoenician language. 3 wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And again, the flashpoint was Sicily. And in the 3 wars, then we can talk about the heroism of people like Hannibal and that type of thing. But ultimately, it was at the end of the wars that the Romans actually conquered Carthage. And by the time we get to 146 BC, Carthage had been destroyed, and the Romans had now seized Carthage. And as the Romans expanded their power, by the time they get to 30 BC, They had now expanded it to taking over Egypt. Do you see? Yeah. If you want, I can go into details of the Punic Wars, but what say you, sir?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because as you're describing it there, I mean, that there were wars between the Greeks and Carthage, the Romans and Carthage, and and of course there's similar wars between the Greeks and the Egyptians in terms of Alexander, and then the Romans in terms of Caesar, in terms of Egypt. All those were occurring, shall we say, concurrently. But when you look at Egypt from that perspective, of course, its history precedes all of that. But it seems as if their conquests were not so much wars. I mean, their conquests are conquests of civilization in terms of them ruling the Mediterranean and the Near East, if you want to call it that. I mean, of course, there were skirmishes and wars occasionally and so on and so forth. But it seemed like most of Egyptian civilization sort of was because of their superiority of their civilization as opposed to the might of their armies. Not that their armies weren't mighty in that sense, but once you get the Greeks coming on board, once you get the Romans coming on board, it's all about war and conquest of territory. I just wanted to throw that in there because that struck me in terms of the history of the period. And I think it's going to continue. It's all destructive as you go further on, from the Roman Empire, and then whatever, the French Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish empires, the Portuguese, all of those. It's all about conquest and territory, not about civilization, and adding anything to the people that you're conquering, if you will. It's all taking away in terms of conquest. It's pillage, really, But it's interesting because I know that the Punic Wars are important because they ended up subjugating the Carthaginians, and that became a part of the Roman Empire, just as Egypt became a part of the Roman Empire. And I think I mentioned this previously. Carthage then must have been very, it may be more desert now, but it was the breadbasket for Rome and their empire at the time. So maybe they used up the soil. I don't know if you know anything about that agricultural aspect of it, because I don't know how productive Tunisia is at the present time in terms of desert and that sort of thing.
I'm aware that during the Arab invasion of North Africa, there was an African queen called Dahia el Kahina who created deforestation. So that the Arab army wouldn't have crops to feed on.
Interesting.
Yeah, again, de Graaf Johnson, I think, mentions this.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly some of that definitely happened. But in the case of Carthage, though, there are some interesting lessons for us Africans because this was an example where Africans controlled trade routes and guarded them zealously. So much so that if you are not Carthaginian and you don't have permission, what on earth is your ship doing in Carthaginian waters? We don't act like that today, do you see? So there's a lot that we can learn from this. All right, now the Punic Wars. The first one was 264 to 241 BC between the Romans and the Carthaginians. Carthage lost and the Romans ended up taking Sicily, right? The second one was 218 to 202 BC. This one was started by Hannibal. You know the Hannibal that we all love, right?
Mhm.
This is where his troops went through Spain, conquered the Alps, and then tried to attack the Romans, but attacked them from the north, right? In the end, Carthage lost that one. Um, some of their African allies switched sides. And as that, in other words, all the kind of the sneak stuff, all the shady stuff that goes on in modern politics, that went on then. And so even though Hannibal looked like he was winning, um, no, that so the Romans ended up seizing, basically beating the Carthaginians in Africa, 202 BC. And what the Carthaginians were subjected to, the Romans put down a peace treaty. And this is what the peace treaty in 201 BC says. Carthage was compelled to return lands that once belonged to their former African ally who switched sides, Numidia. They were forbidden to make war on any people without the consent of Rome. They must hand over all elephants. Elephants were, of course, the beginnings of tank strategy, and not acquire others. They must abandon all ships except 10, and they must pay the Romans a reparation of 10,000 talents of silver over a 50-year period. Doesn't that sound just like modern politics?
Yeah, power politics, of course.
Yeah. All right, so what happened next was, despite this, Carthage actually recovered.
Mm.
And nobody thought that was going to happen. And this is when one of the Roman senators called Cato the Elder, in the Roman Senate, uh, made speeches in the Senate where he would always change the subject of the speech so he could get the phrase, Carthage must be destroyed. And that became something that, and well, no matter, what does the senator think of the government's education policy? Answer, Carthage must be destroyed. And it, based on this, what happened is in 151 BC, the Carthaginians paid off the reparation. So the Romans now had to think, now, how can we destroy Carthage? Well, I mentioned the Romans had an ally in Africa, the Numidians.
Mhm.
Carthage counterattacked Numidia, who had been abusing Carthage for years. And then the Romans said, well, this proves that you breached the treaty. And so the Roman Senate then passed a death sentence on Carthage. And ultimately, Carthage was destroyed in a violent Holocaust in 146 BC. And then after 146 BC, Carthage is no more. There is no Carthage. It is now the beginnings of Roman-controlled Africa.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah?
Wow. Well, this is a history lesson for me for sure because I knew virtually nothing about Carthage, but it's obviously it's of great significance during that period of time that you just covered,
Yeah,
from about 800 BC down to about 150 BC,
yeah,
uh, which is amazing. I mean, it was, contemporaneous with Egypt at some point in time in terms of its ascendancy, although Egypt would have been dwindling also at that point in time. Um, and so we have Greece, and then so we have Rome, and I'm not sure what good things we can say about Rome. I mean, we can say a few good things about Greece, probably, in terms of their intellectual capacity and their learning, some from the Egyptians. But it seems like the Romans were by and large sort of ignoramuses. But they were great soldiers and in some sense great builders of roads and ability to communicate. But they were certainly destructive of everything in their past. I mean, there in North Africa, they did the same thing, obviously in Egypt in terms of destroying, the civilization there. The Greeks tried to accommodate to it, and there was a mixture, shall we say, of the Greeks and the Ethiopians, certainly in terms of northern Egypt and around Alexandria, because Alexandria became such a cosmopolitan city, with the Greek and the Jews as well as obviously the native Egyptians, but the Persians and so on and so forth. All of that sort of, you might say, ended with the Romans just coming in and obliterating everything in their past and replacing it with their own, concepts. And I'm particularly, shall we say, interested in that aspect of it because to cement their dominance, they transformed what the religion was that the Greeks were adopting from Egypt, although the Greeks were transforming it into a sort of an intellectual understanding of the spirituality of the Egyptians. By that I mean, from Pythagoras, all the way back. When did he go to Egypt? Maybe 575 or something like that. But coming all down, the whole mystery religion part of it, and then that was an understanding of the Egyptian religion that the Greeks subscribed to, Dionysus and Osiris and so on. But when the Romans came in, and they, if you will, validated a type of Christianity that was different from the Gnostic Christianity, which was the early Christianity, which was being inherited from Egypt and Greece, and which was, obviously part of the Roman Empire. But it was totally converted, by people like Theodosius and Constantine. I think it was Constantine who, shall we say, validated the Christian religion. I don't remember the exact date, but probably in the 300s or something like that. And he was an SOB. I mean, as an emperor, I think he so-called converted to Christianity, but he didn't get baptized until like the day before he was dying, so that he can be assured that he couldn't commit any more sins. And it was he, after the Council of Nicaea, and again, that was what, 385, correct me with the dates because I don't remember them exactly, but he came back from
I was told it was 325 to 332.
Oh, okay. So when he came back, he assembled the Council of Nicaea, which was, I don't know, 300 plus bishops and so on, to counter the Arian controversy, which was really now deciding whether Christ was a God-man or was really a man, because Arius said he was a man. He couldn't be a God. He was created by God, so he couldn't be a God. And of course, the Council of Nicaea countered this, and that was a heresy. And Constantine, coming back from the council, ended up killing his son, killing his wife, killing his brother-in-law. I mean, this guy was absolutely vicious. And then, from there on, all the others, Theodosius, Justinian, and so on, they wiped out all the early vestiges of the Christianity that was really part of the Gnostic religion that was founded by Egypt and then by the Greeks and some of the Jews, etc. In terms of
Can I
the
jump in there, sir?
aesthetic beauty. Yeah, please do, because you can give more historical significance to what I'm saying. Yes.
And there's another issue is in the early history of Christianity in Africa,
Hmm.
Carthage and Numidia figure very highly.
Hmm.
So you had some people say 17th of July, 180 AD, others give different dates, where 12 African Christians were executed by the Roman-controlled authorities.
Mm.
There was the leader of the group was a 22-year-old African woman called Perpetua. Um, and on the ruined site of Carthage, there was a chapel dedicated to Saint Perpetua. And if you look at some of the Roman Catholic art where they're depicting saints, they make it quite clear that Perpetua is black. Yeah. So there's a whole story. Again, I mentioned Professor John Coleman DeGraff Johnson's book, African Glory. He has a whole chapter called The Early African Church, which is, even though these people are under Roman domination, there is an African church history in Carthage, in Numidia, and in Egypt. And again, and some of what he's got is what you've said. You know, the whole thing about the Arian controversy and that type of thing.
Right. And of course, St. Augustine was in North Africa, and he was around, what, 250 BC and so on. And
Yeah.
he said, I mean, the very thing that was being called Christianity was there with the ancients.
Yeah.
And he actually said from the beginning of the human race. So he
Yeah.
was giving credence to all what was called paganism. And,
Yeah.
and I get that word, and this is one of the things that Europe has done. They try to describe other people as primitive, and they have all these derogatory terms like animism, and paganism, and they act as if, again, quotes, civilization started with them. They act as if, religion came from polytheism, through some kind of pantheism, and then came to monotheism. In other words, these primitive people, had this polytheistic thing, and then it was not until these wonderful Jewish people came along and gave us monotheism, which is total crap. I
Well
mean,
said, sir.
the consciousness is human was always present in human beings. It did not evolve. It has been there for 200,000 years. Once you have a human being, you have human consciousness that is conscious of itself. There's no such thing as primitive consciousness. You see, I mean, but they make you believe that there's such a thing as a primitive man, a primitive Homo sapiens. There's no such thing as a primitive Homo sapiens. You can use different tools and you can dress differently, etc., etc., and that changes over time depending on geography and the culture, etc. But the consciousness of the human being who is able to make choices, who is able to be aware of himself and what he's doing, it's been there for 200,000 years. There's no such thing as primitive man. You see, but they do that, and all that refers to is the tools that he's using. Well, of course, he starts with certain tools because that's what's around him. And then, he invents this and he invents that and he invents that. So, but because there's a new invention of a tool, you believe that you now are better than the person who didn't have that tool. Where does that come from? But that's a European conceit. You see, to try to put them on a pedestal different from, quotes, other human beings. They've been involved in making sophisticated tools over a certain, period of time. And most of the tools they used to kill other people. So how is that a mark of civilization? But just getting back to the religious thing, this is what has poisoned, our minds, and of course, in some sense, that has been deliberate. But I think in a lot of sense, it's been ignorance on the part of Europeans, because when they came and they saw us, and of course Herodotus tells us this, they said, "My God, these Ethiopians, they're the most magnificent people in the world. I mean, they're handsome, they're magnificent, they're spiritual, I mean, he couldn't stop boasting about the Ethiopians. I mean, and that was the reality of the European coming out of the Ice Age, etc., and his own primitive cave dwelling, etc., and seeing these civilized Ethiopians. But then, of course, it became converted over time in order to try to maximize who they think they are. And then they've distorted religion, they've distorted history, they've distorted science. Science became materialism instead of a comprehensive understanding of nature itself, and became a way to try to change nature. And now we have GMOs, and we have this religious fundamentalism, and we have scientific materialism of the worst kind, and we have societies that are in chaos. We have to get back to the original understanding of who we are as human beings, and that has been lost, and that has been the tragedy, because the basis of Christianity again is the African understanding of self, of self as part of nature and as part of the Creator, and that whole relationship, not as simply a physical entity, who receives information through the five senses from the world outside, and then processes that with an intelligence, and then tries to maximize pleasure over pain, or gain over loss, and creates societies based on that. I mean, we can see the end result at the present time in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of the choices in the election in the United States. It's like I think it's like the end of time, so to speak, or an end of times, shall we say. I think we're moving towards something different if the world is not destroyed through the current fracases there in Ukraine and in Gaza, and then in Lebanon, and who knows what will happen to Iran, etc., because the war machine has been, going full tilt, and I'm not sure it knows when to stop.
Well said, sir.
How are we doing time-wise?
I think we've got 2 minutes, so I think we might as well start winding it down.
Yeah, no, I did enjoy Carthage, and because it's like completely new to me. I mean, all I ever knew about Carthage was Hannibal, and his trip, into Europe through Spain and trying to go over the Alps and so on. Of course, his ultimate defeat, but that was a moment of triumph for an African, shall we say, over Europe. But you've certainly filled in a gap there, and it's an important one because it was a significant nation state or empire as you described it, and it fills in that whole business with the Phoenicians and what was going on in the Mediterranean and so on, because the Mediterranean itself was not primarily Egyptian in terms of it on the waters. It was always talked about the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and so this brought it up to date. Of course, also ethnically, we have an understanding of who these people were. So this was a good lesson for me.